giddy, practically, for the first time using the word lesbian in a collective way and stepping out onto the street together, and also how they were, in fact, so positively fierce. I guess I should say we, you know. And I want to talk a little bit about that, about fierceness and what it takes to change things, because you do have to be fierce if you want to change things. You have to be fierce just to open your eyes and see what is out there in the world. And sometimes to admit that you're screwed. And lesbians still are, you know, 25 years later after Lesbian Avengers. Things have changed quite a bit from the 50s, they've changed from the 90s, but the hatred of women persists. Queers are under attack worldwide whenever somebody needs a scapegoat, wherever fundamentalist religions are in power, because it's still there in black and white just what abominations we are. And dykes, of course, are both women and queers, with plenty of other intersecting identities. We only become fierce when we finally realize it could be us getting attacked, or that it is us getting attacked. The funny thing is that fierceness, that kind of righteous anger, also comes with a profound sense of release, of relief. It takes a lot of effort to pretend that everything is all right, that up is down, down is up, no, it doesn't bother me getting groped in the subway, harassed on the street, turned down for that job, denied a visa, denied a home by my own family, seen as a second-class citizen, not seen at all. No, things are great all around. It is a relief to finally have a lens that lets us see the truth and speak the truth. And for the Avengers, a lot of it had to do with many of us embracing that word, lesbian, for the very first time. And you could also see, even though we said it, how awkward we were, like it was a word in a foreign language. It was hard to say back then, and now sometimes it feels even more impossible. There's a lot of pressure not to use this word that has such a disgusting past, and that excludes people. It joins sexual orientation and gender identity in a way that specifically excludes men. Why is this a problem? Because women are never allowed to organize alone, and that goes double for lesbians. For me, it's the only thing that explains why even gay women, queer women, who instinctively understand why it's important to say Black Lives Matter and not All Lives Matter, freak out and get extremely anxious when you ask them to take the plunge and use the word lesbian or dyke. I mean, they slept with a boy once and don't want to exclude him. They have male friends. There's that queer guy who's their best friend. They feel backed into a corner, like Tiger Woods. That time he announced he wasn't black at all. He was mixed, half Asian, part white, part African American. He missed the political point of why so many people still use the word black. Like all those people that refuse to use the word dyke or lesbian, who refuse to acknowledge that we live in a male default universe, a straight universe, just like we're a white default country. And the only time women are visible, the only time dykes are visible, is when we stand alone, physically and linguistically. Words matter. And in a way, it was words that launched the Lesbian Avengers. The group began in 1992, the year that Pat Buchanan went to the Republican National Convention and declared a war, a culture war, for the soul of America. And the enemies of America were the same then as they are now: feminists, environmentalists, black people, and of course, homosexuals, who were out to pervert your children and bring down the family. In New York, this translated into an anti-gay campaign to bring down the rainbow curriculum that was supposed to teach little kids to respect each other. The bigot spearheading this was the white-haired grandmother, Mary Cummins, who managed to do something New York politicians had long declared impossible: to unite evangelical Protestants of all races with a mostly white Catholic hierarchy in her very own rainbow of hate. Now, how did she do it? She searched through several hundred pages of curriculum teaching the Mexican hat dance and other little games for children, and all of this organized to deal with attacks against people of color, not only the murder in Bensonhurst, which had happened just shortly before, but also daily attacks on immigrants, on Latinos, on Asian Americans. Once she extracted 5 or 6 references to queers, voila, the whole thing got rebranded as gay. And a lot of the communities of color that ended up fighting against it never even knew they were getting screwed by people with a white nationalist agenda who really wanted to get rid of the multicultural part as much as they wanted to get rid of the gay part. That is the power of language, of certain words, like black, or white, or gay, or straight, or old, or young. These words that are so broad that they are blank slates that anybody can write on. They're double-edged swords. They deny our individuality and difference at the same time as they erase our sameness. Seen from a microscope or from an airplane, we are all the 1%, sharing more than 99% of our genetic makeup, which is why Ta-Nehisi Coates makes sense when he writes that race is an artificial construct somebody just made up for their slave trading convenience, or why Judith Butler had a cogent argument when she wrote Gender is Performed, except that more than one thing can be true at once. And while there is no inherent meaning in skin tones or gestures or clothes or chromosomes, and while when I wake up in the morning I don't feel male or female, dyke or straight, or even human, when I do finally look in a mirror or someone else looks at me, I take on a fixed social reality that's not in my control. And real or not, it has an impact. But what I discovered in the Avengers is that the game changes when you agree to let them do it. In my case, to let them define me as a lesbian, as a dyke. Because once you decide to inhabit that word with your body, with your language, you have the power to transform it. And in some ways this seems counterintuitive unless you're a masochist, because generally I prefer to run from painful things. And the first time I got called Leslie, I denied it immediately. In fact, I hadn't thought about sexuality or sexual orientation at all. I don't know when this must have happened, maybe middle school or high school or God knows when. And if I sometimes felt like an outsider, I put it down to growing up Southern Baptist and wanting to be a medical missionary, not to being a lesbian, because everybody knew that leslie meant sick and perverse and disgusting, and I knew that I wasn't. So it was impossible. It didn't cross my mind. And in fact, I contributed to it because I buried my desires as deep and as dark and as far away as I could. Even when I was finally sleeping with a woman and we had girls outside our room at Yellowstone where we were working, yelling, Leslie, 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 I still didn't accept the word. Not that it mattered, because even when I finally decided that bi maybe was okay as a label, because I didn't hate men or fit in among the lesbians I knew, I was too brainy for the sporty dykes, too sporty and poor white trash for the brains, and I fucking hated folk music. Even then, I'd have a bunch of guys in the car throwing beer bottles at me and screaming, fucking dyke. I was still half in the closet when I joined the Avengers. I only went so I could meet girls. And the whole reason that I volunteered eventually to start facilitating meetings is that I was going to have to say the Lesbian Avengers is a direct action group focused on lesbian survival and visibility. I had to say it. Lesbian, lesbian, lesbian. It took a long time for the word to sink in, and for me to get over the very intense disgust I had, and to accept that the word lesbian means me, and I mean lesbian. Lesbian means Anna, and Maxine, and Andrea, and Carolina, and Rachel, and Ricky Wilkins, whom you may know as a trans activist. She was in that room also. And of course, the more we said it, and the more we put our bodies into the street as dykes, to eat fire, to scream, to walk, to waltz, to laugh, to sing, to rage, the more the word lesbian stretched to make room for all of us. And it changed not only what outsiders thought lesbians were, but changed what we thought lesbians were, which was important. Because every time I hear that the word lesbian is old-fashioned, I kind of want to scream a little bit. because there never was some golden age when lesbian was on every lesbian lip, when it was actually in fashion. Like I said, even in 1992, when we were out in the streets as openly lesbian as a human can get, many of us still struggle to pronounce the word. And during the 70s, which I guess could be considered a golden era of activism and lesbian culture, lesbians were founding projects right and left, from music festivals to Sinister Wisdom or Kitchen Table Press. The word lesbian was really only used by a small, brave minority that weren't afraid of losing their jobs, or their families, or their children, or their lives, or getting hauled to the shrinks, or locked up in mental hospitals, tossed in jail. It was much more common to have women's bookstores, and women's music festivals, and women's marches. You were just supposed to know that they were mostly geared towards dykes. But in 1992, we finally had enough legal space to use the word, lesbian. Even if the guy who printed the balloons for the very first action kept asking how to spell it. And because the Lesbian Avengers defined the word as broadly as possible, by putting our bodies behind it, and because both our goal and our method were simple, direct action for lesbian visibility, we could build a movement. We could mobilize tens of thousands of women for Dyke Marches. We could found 60 chapters worldwide. And I see some parallels in the group Black Lives Matter. That name, that movement is so powerful, in part because it is simple. Black Lives Matter. With the words alone, with the bodies behind them, it attacks white supremacy head on. And as for the Lesbian Avengers, lesbian, this word, pronouncing it, using it, holding it in your body, attacks the intersection of misogyny and homophobia in a way that the unisex word queer just can't, or the masculine default gay, and anything at all paired with women, which immediately opens the door to the ideas of men. And while I understand the importance of thinking about fluidity and imagining some world without gender binaries or the need to have these sorts of identities at all, in this one, lesbian is the only single word that in 2.5 syllables slams the door on straight privilege. And for once, just briefly, it shines the spotlight on us as a class of people, as a community with unique problems that require unique solutions. The minute we abandoned the word, quit putting our flesh behind it, except once a year at Dyke Marches, and the rest of the time insisting that how we define ourselves is more important than confronting the definition of outsiders, then we left it blank again for people to fill with stereotypes. Now, it often feels like, even in my own community, lesbian once again means those humorless, angry, man-hating, ugly, stupid creatures. And besides creating a vacuum of identity and community, abandoning the word lesbian means we are once again invisible in projects for women and projects for queer, and we lose an important tool for social change. Now, I was a few weeks ago at a European lesbian conference, and they crunched the numbers, and out of $424 million budgeted for international LGBTI issues in 2013 and 14, only 2% went towards projects for lesbians, bi, and queer women. And out of hundreds of recommendations put forward at the UN in recent years, only one addressed specifically lesbian issues. Now, in October, when they held the first European Lesbian Conference in Vienna, 2 researchers had decided to prepare a report about lesbian lives for the conference, and they discovered that we were almost on par with unicorns when it came to mining data, even among countries in the relatively progressive European Union. Now, this has consequences. This means that these researchers were not only limited in the conclusions that they could draw, but they were screwed as European lesbian activists, because to propose a project, for instance, on lesbian mental health, you have to have figures for the population. You have to have figures proving it's needed. You have to have figures to create a model on how it might function, and also for the results you might hope to achieve. Ditto for projects addressing violence against lesbians. No data, no funding, no action. And we need action. Take the case of the anti-queer purge in Chechnya. Most of us have heard about how black gay men and trans women in Chechnya are being targeted by police stings. They're being kidnapped, tortured, and sometimes killed. But we've heard very little about lesbians. And it's tempting to think they're not being bothered. But in fact, it's because of women's lowly status in Chechnya. Unlike gay men, we simply don't have a chance to escape. Women are barely allowed to leave their homes, and we aren't allowed to study or work abroad. We certainly don't meet for quickies. So rather than sending us to jail or torturing or killing us in custody, the cops or our neighbors or relatives simply put pressure on our immediate family to kill us at home. And they do. Things aren't much better in Kazakhstan. At the conference, 2 Kazakh dykes talked about how they and their friends had been targeted or beaten up, and how if you reported to the cops, you might get beaten again. Or they might out you at your job, tell your families, you might beat you at work, so they blackmail you. If cops find 2 women alone in a car, they will drag you from the car and they will smell your fingers. Now, how can we support lesbians whose lives no one can see? Like every researcher at the conference, these 2 Kazakh dykes begged for help collecting data. They begged for lesbians to come out and stay out. Because each visible life, each visible lesbian tells young dykes that they aren't alone. And it creates room to maneuver for everybody else that can't come out. And they said if you have the privilege to be out and visible as a lesbian, you should be. I've been thinking a lot about privilege lately, and identity, and how it works with language. There's this passage I go back to pretty often in The First Man by Albert Camus, where he writes about growing up in Algeria, where his family was so poor that one time he was a kid and he lied about spending a few pennies, saying they had fallen into the outhouse. His grandmother went into the backyard and stuck her hand down into the shit to look for these pennies. Now that's poor. So the thing that struck him, in fact, when he discovered other homes, no matter if they were those of his school pals, or later those from a more privileged world, was the number of vases, of glasses, of figures, of paintings that stuffed the rooms. In his house, you said, the vase that is on the mantle, or the pot, the bowl. There were an assortment of objects that didn't even have names. In contrast, at his uncle's, one was made to admire the stoneware fired at Vosges when ate on the Quimper china. He had always grown up in the middle of a poverty as naked as death among common nouns. At his uncle's, he discovered proper nouns. And I wonder what it means, the fact that US queers now have so many words to describe ourselves, at least in the privacy of our homes. I wonder if the fact that we insist on them in public is a sign of progress, or sometimes of privilege, that in some ways it's a delusion that allows us to believe that how each of us defines ourselves is more important than common ground, or than confronting the bigotry hidden behind the language of the world. One consequence, besides being visible, or being invisible to the larger world, is that we're increasingly divided from each other, meaning we can't see what we do have in common, and often can't recognize the systematic discrimination we face as a class. And it's there. It's a reality, no matter what we call ourselves. And a symptom of this is that right now, not one of the American dykes I know is working on a project directed towards lesbians. Fine, no problem. We have a lot going on right now. And yes, I know who's president. But when I recently suggested to several of these activist dykes that they maybe just incorporate a little focus on lesbians into their other work for women, for queers, for immigrants, against mass incarceration or racism or poverty, I was met with an embarrassed silence. And the only woman who spoke up said she wasn't going to put her work on pause until she found some token lesbian case. She couldn't see that lesbians were already there. Lesbians face worse job discrimination than straight women. We are sent to jail far more often than het-seeming women when faced with the same charge. We face harassment, marginalization, violence, especially trans women who are lesbians. And let's be honest, black dyke lives don't matter. none of our dyke lives really count. To paraphrase James Baldwin, this is the crime of which I accuse my country, my queer community, that dyke lives are being destroyed all over the world, and we do not know it and do not want to know it. It is not permissible that we who are complicit in our devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime. And dyke lives won't matter, they won't be visible, unless occasionally, just occasionally, lesbians have the nerve, the ferocity to stand alone. Well, not alone, even with each other, in our flesh, but also in our language, using the only word we have right now that describes women, however you define the word women, primarily attracted to other women. Despite the stereotypes that we gobble up like ice cream, there are no political qualifications, no sports certificates you must have, or clothes in your closet. Your hair can be of any length and degree of cleanliness. You can identify wherever you want on the gender spectrum, have whatever body you want. You know, I'm sorry that there are no nicer, no perfect words, but in politics, in the public realm, language is a cudgel. It's not a scalpel, but it's what we have, especially those of us that don't have big resources, especially those of us that are poor. Our voices and our bodies, that's what we have. It's how we communicate, share information, claim space, how we recognize each other. Above all, it's how we resist, and it is urgent to resist this world filled with so much hate and inequality. Not only to resist out of anger, or fear, or desperation, but out of love, as Maxine said in the video, to make visible the love we have for ourselves and each other when we organize and take direction together on our own behalf. The lesbian is dead. Long live the lesbian. Well, the Avengers were started by 6 people that got together and said, let's do this. And they picked the name, which is good. Picked a good name. And they were pretty clear on wanting it to be out front immediately, this is lesbian, this is not something else. An Avenger, they were throwing around different names, but I think it was inspired by the old show, The Avengers. And I think because I think it was easier because the word lesbian was paired with Avenger, so that you could, maybe if you weren't comfortable with lesbian, you might be comfortable with, but, oh, Lesbian Avenger. And also in that context, it's an adjective and it's not a noun, so that it's not quite, it doesn't get you quite as much. But I think everybody in the room for many of us, it was the first time we were using the word lesbian to describe ourselves in a way that was not just occasional, but we're going to use it, we're going to own it, we're going to go out onto the street as this thing. And it did become easier and easier because the word was defined, because we were defining it. It wasn't the world saying this is what a lesbian was, it was us saying, well, these people in this room, we are lesbians. Did that get part of it?
Yeah, no, no.
Other questions?
Because the video shows the 90s, you know,
Yes.
I'm wondering about being able to say that word and go into public places and say that word, and how that's changed, or maybe is more necessary now or differently
one of the things about different forms of homophobia and transphobia, racism, anti-Semitism, all of these things, they don't hate just abstractions, they hate you in your flesh. And so you almost can't, there has to be some moment when you take the leap and go from online activism to putting your body behind that word and taking over public spaces. And not necessarily just in terms of like organized groups of activism, but in assigning that word to yourself in public, because, and the language is very, very important, because there are many cultures, and including the South where I come from, that you can actually have a girlfriend, and that girlfriend can come home with you, and maybe become a member of the family, and that's cool until the moment you use the word lesbian, and then that's horribly dangerous. And I'm sure that people of color have also experienced that there's, you know, you get kind of provisionally accepted, just like I've had an immigrant experience where you're just kind of assumed to be one of the dominant culture, kind of adopted provisionally. And then there's some moment when you say, use one of these words, like you say, but I'm an American, I don't think that way. Or you say, I'm Latina, or you say, I'm black, and then suddenly the temperature in the room sinks. Because you said that thing that everybody knew, but articulating it totally changes the game. So it was urgent to be out and using these names that, and let's say names maybe instead of labels, because what are labels but names, and who has the luxury to not have labels but people that never actually have to inhabit their flesh in public. But I think it was urgent then, and it's still urgent, because every right that we have and that we have gained can be taken away. We've seen things slipping away. And for many people in many places in many parts of the country, things never got that good.
I'm curious in thinking about how we reclaim and re-embody these words, and where the line, if you think about there being a line between lesbian and dyke. So my lived experience in the last 7 or 8 years is that I know a lot of individuals who are willing to say that they're dykes, and understand that to be sort of an interior term that isn't relative in the way that they experience lesbian as being relative word.
I think lesbian is kind of the word that communicates in public. You know, now we do have LGBTQI, and there's more not kind of understanding of what those things mean, at least a little bit. But you know, I tend to use the word dyke myself more than lesbian, and part of it is you can make that word so ugly, lesbian. You know, and that's how I heard it. You know, like you hear some horrible person talking about the gays and the lesbians on TV, and they say it in such a way you're like, ew. And I think that contributes to people not wanting to use it. But on the other hand, you don't want the straight people talking about the dykes. It becomes awkward for them, because they, you know, when they say it, but you said it, you know, like, which is, and I don't mind too much, but you can see they're not comfortable with either word, you know. So I don't know. Some of it is personal preference, but at least with dyke, you know what they're talking about. I mean, I think when people use the word queer, that word, while I use the word queer also sometimes, but that word is so vague. That word can mean anything. And now straight people use the word to mean they're a little different, or to absolve themselves of the privileges that they have as straight people. I mean, and that's some of the, yes.
Other question?
Yep.
I think building on what Liz, is it, you said language is a cudgel. Is it harder to use language with like sort of the solid force for cudgel in a world where words have proliferated so much compared to like the 90s? Like
no shortage of language, that is true these days, especially online, and when it comes to organizing. And there's also no shortage of calls for action that is really just clicking. I think when people tell the truth, it seems to often have some sort of impact. When people go straight to the heart of the matter and don't hem and they don't haw and they don't equivocate and they don't, I think the truth still works pretty cudgely. And I think when language spoken by actual people in the flesh, that has an impact. And I still think that people can tell the difference between speakers that just kind of run off at the mouth and people that have something to say. I think everybody I knew was really excited at the beginning of like social media and thinking this is a great, great tool. And you can find a way to be visible, like when you don't have access to mainstream media, suddenly everybody could do it-yourself media and bring their issues out. And then with more and more and more language, it did get diluted, and suddenly it's just as hard as it ever was to become visible or to make an issue visible, which means that you have to go back to the street the same way that you had to before. And the thing about action and direct action and being visible is that truly all we own is our bodies and our voices. And people have been using the streets of their cities ever since there were cities. And people have been doing it with anger, and people have been doing it with humor, and people have been doing it whichever way that they can to get their voices heard, truly. And I think that's the tool that we have. And social media enhances it. It allows us to organize, but a lot of times it's just like the good old phone tree where one person would call 5 people and those people would call 5 people. It's just quicker. But in itself, it does nothing. Like, inherent in social media, it's just media. It's just what media has always been good for.
Can you say something about the understanding of direct action here? Especially in clips, the combination of humor and confrontation. You compare this sort of direct action to some act up action, which I remember was far less humorous, probably for obvious reasons. But can you say something about the humor, the joyfulness of it, combined with the confrontational, avenging character of it?
Well, I mean,
It's a specific form of direct action.
yeah, I mean, direct action in general is just kind of, God, what is it? How do you define it? It's actions of whatever kind. I think part of the reason our actions had elements of humor is because those were the people that were in the group there, and that was who we were. I mean, we were people that had senses of humor, but also because we're dykes, and you know what the stereotype is. You know that if you are always descending into the street angry, you're going to be those horrible angry dykes. So there is the burden to find, and the people will ignore you and ignore your message. So there was the calculated spin of let's do what will engage us with our audience. But also some of it was, the goal was lesbian visibility and lesbian survival and bringing attention to lesbian issues. And because it's lesbian visibility, we started with so little that we just had to step out into the street together and scream. And so also you have to entertain yourself a little bit, so waltzing. We went to Mary Cummins' house and serenaded her in the middle of the night. And the thing is when lesbians do it, it's scary, even if you're just singing. It is scary.
You could throw rocks.
Well, but the thing is we didn't need to. And also, one of the things about activism that's always true of activism, you're doing it to communicate with the outside world, because whatever action you do is a form of communication. But you're also doing it to see the people around you and to see who is in this group of people that thinks like I do, that there are other people in the world that are like me. So every time you step into the street and do an action, it's also for internal consumption. If in that moment you need to be out on the street with torches fighting with cops, that's what you do. But on other times when you know that that politician is going to be just as upset if you sing at him, you go and you sing at him. And it's also better for your mental health to not do 100% really furious actions because.
Well, we can